So thanks. I've got Jess Stone from Swindon Academy here, and we're just going to talk through some of the things that they've been doing with Microsoft Teams. So Jess, how did it start that your children were able to join Teams meetings remotely? What kind of setup did you do?
So first of all, we had the children all with Chromebooks out in the classroom in the previous week, which we had planned in anyway before anticipating any form of lockdown was actually going to happen. But just through that, I was then on Teams myself and sharing my screen onto the big screen with them in the classroom, whilst the other two teachers were then able to administer any teething issues to begin with.
Yeah, and did you get kind of a lot of teething issues? What were the kind of things that they had to deal with, just so other teachers are aware, really?
Yeah, I mean, mainly logging on was a huge issue to begin with, which I think surprised us because you automatically just think everyone can do that. But the children definitely found just being able to use a mouse and actually use the keyboard, because they're so used to normally using the touch screens, that definitely navigating their way around a keyboard was something that was very new to them and something that we could tell that they clearly hadn't done a lot of. So just being able to log on and know their username and password was already quite a task, and then actually being able to get on to Office 365 proved quite difficult to begin with. But when we did end up obviously going into lockdown in the second week, our head teacher then sent out an instructional visualizer to show them exactly what to do, which I think did help a lot of the children, especially as the children probably knew more than what their parents did.
Yeah, understood. And so in that scenario, where were you? Were you still in school, kind of teaching those remote learners, or were you yourself kind of away from school?
We were away from school as well, because obviously where we had most of the year group that had gone into isolation, there were 6 of us that also had to isolate as well. So that was all kind of going on from home, which was quite difficult to begin with. But I think after a couple of days, we did start to get into it. And obviously we had to make a lot of tweaks along the way. There were definitely a number of issues to begin with that we didn't even anticipate being issues, but what ended up being so, until we actually managed to navigate our way around ourselves and obviously show the children that as well.
Yeah, so when you wanted to sort of start a live lesson, did you tend to use like class teams, or did you just set up an ad hoc meeting?
Yeah, so we had a class team. We've got 2 classes in year 6 here, so we just had whichever class they were part of as their team. And I know one team only had about half the class because the other half were actually in school, whereas the team that I had did have a full class. And you definitely saw the differences in terms of the numbers that we had to then cater for then, because the class that had the most numbers in, there were a lot more issues, shall we say, than what the other class had, in terms of the children being able to obviously have a lot of control over Teams with what adults usually have as well, where they could comment on the conversation thread, they could start meetings themselves. Which we did see a lot of in the first few days. I think the children were very excited to suddenly have all this almost freedom around this site. And then we realized that we obviously could then schedule meetings rather than just calling them, which we put in place. I had it that I could only allow them into the lobby as well, into the actual meeting from the lobby, just because otherwise they would join earlier. And then we ended up having quite a number of issues where the children were constantly in a Teams call together rather than doing any of the work that wasn't live. So we had it that they just ended up having to wait until I was able to let them in. And I just changed the settings as soon as I then entered the meeting so that then they could freely come in. And yeah, we had to make sure we knew a lot of restrictions. Ended up doing quite a bit of YouTubing in terms of how to sort the restrictions on Teams where they couldn't mute people or kick people out of the meeting and things like that, which definitely was an issue to begin with. But as we got into it, they had stopped that, which was good. And then it was definitely a lot more plain sailing as we got on.
There are some sort of, global policy settings you can apply that would probably have helped, but until you get started, you don't actually know what the problems are you're trying to fix. So
no, definitely.
So well done for getting there in the end. Did you find some sort of code of conduct was needed, that you kind of agreed with the pupils in advance, or you, given your situation, you had to kind of implement as you went along?
Yeah, we implemented it as we went along, and we kind of said if this situation was to happen again and for any other year groups, that this would need to be shared with them at the very beginning, in terms of just the way that they also conducted themselves on the conversation thread and kept it more to actual work or any issues they might have had throughout the day, rather than just speaking to each other as if it was social media. Which obviously quite a few did try to begin with, but then we were able to kind of, control that a lot as well. And there were times when we did go into live lessons where I actually muted the children from being able to comment or anything like that, because obviously they could just use the hand icon to put their hand up. And then obviously then be invited to unmute and have any answer any questions, and that definitely worked better than what it had done previously, because we had a lot of children ending up commenting lots rather than actually listening to the lesson. So it worked a lot better to turn that off when we were actually delivering the live lesson, and then obviously we could then see any questions coming through from those children with their little hand icon up, which worked really well.
I'm quite interested in that situation where you had like half in the classroom, half isolating at home. What was the kind of impact on the children in the classroom as opposed to those kind of joining remotely? Did it have an impact, or was the teacher able to kind of carry on more or less as normal?
So they still had the same diet as the other year sixes that were at home, because obviously we didn't want too much of a difference in what they were receiving in terms of the curriculum. So they still had the same work, and they had one of our teachers doing similar to us, where they would be live teaching the class, but obviously the children in school also had a supply teacher and other members of staff in there to obviously manage any issues or behaviour and things like that, and they were just doing it in their books rather than all having a Chromebook each. So in that sense, they didn't have any of the technical issues, which obviously where we were then delivering it at home, we found that the lessons, we ended up being almost a lesson behind each time because of how much we could get done in that short space of time, just where we were being able to address any issues and things like that, which definitely, like I said, in the first few days, it took more time to explain to the children where they can find things. We used Class Notebook as our main tool for where the children could obviously use the handouts pages and had their own work that they could edit. That worked really well for most children. Obviously, we did have quite a few children that said they couldn't find it or they couldn't type and things like that. So whether or not that was actually an issue or whether they just were struggling themselves, so they did have books as an alternative that they could use to write in rather than type if it got to that point. But obviously we were trying to get the children to be able to type so that we could see what work they were then producing.
Yeah. So that class notebook sounds really useful. But in terms of your kind of that lesson structure for a live lesson, particularly when I'm thinking of children who are remote, did you have to kind of shorten the lesson or change your kind of delivery approaches in terms of, the content you were sharing with them?
Yeah, so we shortened the lessons to just 40 minutes rather than what would usually be an hour. And most of the time, obviously, it was us actually modelling to the children, sharing our screens, showing them. But we did find throughout as well that we had to take regular breaks where we could then ask the children if they did have any questions. Certainly where I found that I was sharing my screen, I couldn't actually see the teams where any children were suddenly showing up their hand icon. So I had to kind of go back to and from. So I certainly found that I needed to just say something short to begin with and then go to teams to see what anyone said. Or obviously we had to change anything of talk to the person next to you, because obviously they didn't have anything like that, which obviously where we do that normally in class, that was quite difficult to suddenly get your head around and you knowing that it was just them on their own. But I did really like, though, the sharing of ideas still, and being able to do that remotely. The children really respected each other with what each person was saying, and they then followed on from that, and that was really effective, because I thought that would be quite difficult, where obviously we weren't able to see each other, we weren't able to actually communicate physically, but yeah, they dealt with that really, really well, and that lent itself to the learning particularly well as well.
Yeah, and when you were doing your modelling and you worked examples, whatever, how did you kind of manage that? Did you use visualizers, PowerPoint, other bits of software? Any tips there?
So I used OneNote as well, and just shared my screen of that with them. And because we've got Surface Pros, we can write on the screen as well, which they were then able to see. So that was really good, because it was almost like I had the whiteboard there, which they were then working from. We certainly found in the likes of maths lessons, it was easier for the children to work in their books from what we were showing them what they would have seen on their screen, rather than having to type anything in because of the use of different symbols and things like that, which obviously would just take time to learn. But we found that actually getting through it and getting a nice chunk done, the children needed to just have their books in front of them rather than doing anything on the screen. But certainly with reading and writing, which we also delivered live, they were able to type, and we were then able to see their work then, which was good.
Yeah. And in terms of kind of that webcam bit, did you instruct the children to turn their webcams on or off? Did you have a mixture? How did that work? Because some teachers think it's important to see the children, or on the other hand, they might think it would be an invasion of privacy. How did you tackle kind of webcams?
Yeah, so I don't know whether it's an actual what's the word? What the Chromebooks don't have, where the children weren't actually able to show their videos anyway when we came onto Teams, because right. A lot were asking, I can't get my video on, it doesn't let me video. So I don't think that was then an option for them. So they all ended up just having their having no camera on, and then they were just able to unmute themselves. Obviously, I think it did work quite well in the sense that they weren't able to almost distract each other then from seeing each other. But we also had, on the first 2 days before we actually went into live teaching, where they were using Microsoft Sway for those 2 days, we did have a live meeting at the start of the day, so that we could explain to them exactly where to find the Sway and what to do. And a lot of them then had their camera on, because they didn't have the use of their Chromebook at that point, because they hadn't been delivered out to them. So that was quite nice for them to obviously be able to see each other those first 2 days in that first meeting. But then from then on, it ended up being that they weren't able to share their camera, which I don't think it was too bad. Like I said, it enabled them not to be as distracted.
Yeah, understood. And in terms of that kind of engagement in a lesson, obviously you shortened it to try and help with that. Were there any tips or techniques? How could you tell if children were actually, engaged in what you were doing? How can you improve that, do you think, when you're doing these live lessons?
Yeah, so I think that was probably one of the hardest things, because obviously it was the question whether they were just having problems with the technology or whether they were actually having problems with the understanding. I know I did have quite a number of children, and a couple of parents sometimes suddenly unmute themselves and say, I really didn't get that. Can you go through that again? Which was absolutely fine, because obviously that worked really well. And it was nice then that obviously the parents were getting involved with their children and supporting them as well. But yeah, it definitely was the case of some work pieces I looked at and I noticed that child hadn't done as much, or almost didn't show that understanding, when I know usually, knowing the child, they would have done. So I put it down to it being that technical issue. And like I said, we had quite a few children say that they had technical issues. So we just then said, just write it in your book then, because we'd rather you get something down than nothing at all, sort of thing. So yeah, I definitely say that was probably the trickiest part of being able to actually assess for the learning going on at the time.
Yeah. And were there any kind of other opportunities for sort of feedback from any work that, children did independently outside of that, team's lesson? I mean, for example, did you use the class notebook for that kind of thing, or that was more general handouts?
Yeah, so we did also use the class notebook for lessons that weren't live as well. So originally we were placing in voiceover PowerPoints as files into the class notebook under their name, and obviously they were able to locate them absolutely fine. Once they had their name, they could see where they needed to click. However, we had a number of them have issues actually then being able to download the PowerPoint, whether it was just them not being able to, or whether it was them not being able to click on the right thing, or that ended up being that issue. So instead we decided to do just the lessons in the class notebook and just provide audio clips instead, to kind of replace that voice over PowerPoint. And that seemed to work quite well with lessons such as spellings and arithmetic, for example. And then they would then have a wider curriculum subject that wouldn't be live later on in the afternoon.
Yeah, understood. And in terms of that Teams tool set, you mentioned the raised hand tool. Obviously you found that useful. Were there any other kind of elements in Teams that you used? I don't know if you tried any of the polls or anything like that.
No, we didn't get a chance to this time round, but it's certainly something that we would consider next time. I know there's also an element of being able to assign work, and for the children to then be able to complete an assignment and obviously submit that, which we would look at putting in next time as well. I think for the first time round, we just wanted to get the children confident with using the Chromebooks themselves and being able to actually navigate their way around it to begin with. But yeah, certainly there's lots on there that I know would actually be great really for remote learning.
Yeah, and now you've kind of done it once. You're kind of back in school now. How does that Teams piece still fit, or is it kind of boxed off and then you'll go and use it again? Should a remote learning scenario be needed?
Yeah, so obviously the Teams are still there, and I think going forward, obviously we got to the end of term on Friday and we were only back on the Wednesday, so it was almost, we only had a few days with them actually in person anyway. But going forward, I think we definitely need to still be almost drip feeding elements of how to locate places on Teams and things like that, just in our usual lessons, so that if that were to happen again, they would already have that knowledge then to take with them, so that they don't forget what they did last time, or so that they've already got a wealth of things that are there available to them, such as different files or things like that. I think it's definitely something that we will consider, just in case that this happened again.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you've kind of you yourself and the children there have learned an awful lot in a relatively short space of time to be able to get up and running so quickly with this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I remember at the very beginning of it, I was almost having kittens, thinking, how on earth is this going to work? But certainly, yeah, certainly by the end of the first week, which would have been around the third day of them having the live teaching elements, and once we'd kind of managed to tackle those first teething issues, it certainly was starting to go really well. And then we obviously just had a couple of days the week after, but then we were back in again. So
That's great.
yeah,
Well, thanks very much, Jess,
that's all right.
for talking to us today. And I'm sure teachers will find this very useful.